Nearly a century after Jack the Ripper caused panic in the streets of Victorian London, a second Ripper terrorized the women of cities and towns in the northern county of Yorkshire and in neighboring Lancashire. For 5 years, the British police were unable to apprehend the killer and were even deliberately misled by a malicious deceiver. When the true felon was at last arrested, he admitted bludgeoning, stabbing, and mutilating 20 women, 13 of whom he had killed. The killings began in the city of Leeds on October 30th, 1975, when part-time prostitute Wilma McCann, 28, and the mother of 4 was making her way unsteadily home after a night out. Without warning, a heavy hammer smashed down twice into the back of her head, shattering her skull. Her attacker dragged her dead body into nearby playing fields, ripped open her jacket and blouse, and stabbed her 14 times in the chest and stomach. Prostitutes pursue a dangerous trade, so the police considered this an isolated incident. Indeed, they would have similarly regarded the killing of another prostitute, 42-year-old Emily Jackson, found dumped on January 20th, 1976, in the heart of the Leeds red light district, but for one disturbing fact. Both women had been killed with blows from a headed hammer and stabbed frenziedly many times with the sharpened point of a Phillips crosshead screwdriver. At this time, and for several years after, the police made no connection to 2 previous attacks, in both of which the assaulted women had survived. On July 5, 1975, 34-year-old Anna Rogulski had been attacked with a hammer in Keighley, and on August 15th, 46-year-old Olive Smelt had been bludgeoned and slashed across the buttocks in Halifax. Both towns were within a half-hour drive of Leeds. On the night of May 9th, 1976, 20-year-old Marcella Claxton was assaulted in Roundhay Park, Leeds. She screamed, and her attacker, whom she described as a man with a dark beard, ran off. Detectives were convinced that this had been an abortive attempt by the same killer. For 10 months there were no more reported attacks, and the police began to hope that the murderer had been imprisoned for a different crime or even committed suicide. Their hopes were dashed, however, when the characteristically mutilated body of another prostitute was found in Roundhay Park on February 6, 1977. Irene Richardson, 28, had been struck down with 3 massive blows from a ball-headed hammer. Some of her clothing had been torn off, and she had been stabbed more than 20 times with a knife and a Phillips screwdriver. It was now that the press named the serial killer the Yorkshire Ripper. Following the killing of Irene Richardson, panic spread through the Leeds red light district. Many of the prostitutes moved away to London, Birmingham, and Manchester, while others traveled only a few miles to the neighboring city of Bradford. But Bradford was not far enough away. On April 23rd, 32-year-old Patricia Atkinson, a divorced mother of 3 daughters who had taken up prostitution to make ends meet, was killed there in her own home. Her skull was shattered with 4 hammer blows, and she had been stabbed 7 times in the stomach. Then, on the night of June 25th, 16-year-old shop assistant Jane MacDonald was walking home from a night out with friends when she was hammered to death and stabbed in the characteristic way. Detectives had to assume that this was a mistake on the Ripper's part. Jane lived close to the red light district and only 6 houses away from the home of Wilma McCann. Her death provoked a public outrage, but the police were still no nearer finding the killer. On the night of July 27th, Maureen Long, 30, was walking home through the center of Bradford when she was offered a ride home by a man. He drove to some wasteland and struck her from behind with a hammer. He then drove off, leaving her lying on the ground, apparently dead. But she survived and described her attacker as a man with blonde hair, a detail that added further confusion to the investigation. After this, the Ripper changed his killing ground to Lancashire. On October 1st, he drove over the Pennines to Manchester and picked up 20-year-old Jean Jordan. Taking her into a cemetery, he killed her with 11 ferocious hammer blows. Then he dragged her body into some thick bushes, but without completing his ritual, he left. Back home in Yorkshire, he realized that he had given her a new £5 banknote from his wage packet, which might be traced to him. So a week later, he drove back to the cemetery and found Jean's body where he had left it. But he could not find the note, which was hidden in a secret pocket in her purse. Now, however, he was overcome with the irresistible urge to mutilate the body, using a shard of broken glass that he found close by. The grotesquely slashed corpse was found the next day. On discovering the banknote, the police traced it to a bank in Shipley, just north and more or less part of Bradford, where it had been issued in payrolls for factories in the area. Officers interviewed more than 5,000 men who might have received it. One of these was a truck driver named Peter Sutcliffe, who, although interviewed twice, answered the police questions so politely and openly that they dismissed him as a suspect. The next killing, that of 22-year-old prostitute Yvonne Pearson, came on January 21st, 1978. However, her mutilated body, beaten with hammer but not stabbed, was not discovered for 2 months. 10 days later, Helen Ritka, 18, vanished, and her body was found 2 days later, battered and stabbed. Uncharacteristically, it appeared that her killer had also assaulted her sexually and so left evidence of his blood group type B. More than 200 detectives had by now been assigned to the case, and the UK press and TV coverage devoted to the Yorkshire Ripper was constant, but without any evidence being forthcoming. On May 16th, the Ripper struck again and once more in Manchester when Vera Millward, a 41-year-old prostitute, was battered with a club hammer, her torso stabbed and slashed. Then, for an inexplicable 11 months, the killings again ceased. However, the nightmare returned with a new and even more sinister variation. The Ripper had stopped stalking prostitutes and turned to attacking lone women at random. On the night of April 4th, 1979, 19-year-old Josephine Whitaker, a clerk with a company in Halifax, was walking the short distance home from a visit to her grandparents. The Ripper struck her once with his hammer, dragged her body into thick undergrowth, and stabbed it repeatedly with his screwdriver. The investigation was misled for some months by several letters and a tape recording that allegedly came from Jack the Ripper, and for a time police theorized that the killer lived in the northeast town of Sunderland, with a job that brought him frequently to Leeds. But while squads of detectives turned their attention to the north, the Ripper continued his lethal campaign in the Leeds area. There was only a single killing in the 16 months that followed the murder of Josephine Whitaker. On September 1st, 1979, Barbara Leach, a 20-year-old student at Bradford University, fell victim to the Ripper, her body repeatedly stabbed with an identical screwdriver. But the terror returned on August 18th, 1980, government employee Marguerite Walls, 45, had stayed late in her office because she was going on holiday the following day. Her body was found 2 days later. She had been hammered to death and then strangled, but strangely, her body was not mutilated. Over the next 2 months, there were 2 unsuccessful attempts by the Ripper. Then, on November 17th, he made his final killing. Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student at Leeds University, was only yards from her hall of residence when she was struck to the ground with a hammer. The Ripper dragged her body into some nearby bushes, stripped her, and stabbed her repeatedly. It was on January 2nd, 1981, that the Ripper set out again, carrying his hammer and screwdriver in his coat pocket. In Sheffield, nearly as far from Leeds as Manchester, he picked up Olive Reevers and offered her £10 for sex. As he drove off, a police car pulled up in front of him, suspicious of the registration plates on the Ripper's car. The dark-bearded driver gave his name as Peter Williams and asked if he might relieve himself at the roadside. When he returned to his car, the police had already checked the registration. The plates were stolen. Arrested and taken to the local police station, Williams again asked permission to go to the lavatory. 2 Ripper Squad detectives, learning of the arrest, arrived next day to interview him. Alerted, the police officers who had arrested him returned immediately to the site where they had picked him up. There they found, almost at once, a discarded ball-headed hammer and a sharpened screwdriver. Also, back at the police station, there was a knife hidden in the lavatory cistern. Williams now gave his true name as Peter Sutcliffe, aged 34, and his occupation as a truck driver. Most importantly, he confessed to being the Yorkshire Ripper. His full statement took 17 hours to record. He was charged with 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. However, the detectives were embarrassed by some of Sutcliffe's admissions. In 1969, he said, he had stalked a prostitute and coshed her with a loaded sock. Further, in the same year, he had been arrested carrying his hammer, with his admitted purpose of having it with an intent to kill, yet fined merely for going equipped for burglary. Yet, in 1971, he had clubbed another prostitute, unconscious, in Bradford. Sutcliffe stood trial at London's Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on May 5, 1981. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but on May 22nd, the jury found him guilty on all 20 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life with recommendation that he should serve at least 30 years. Soon after, prison psychiatrists pronounced him insane, and he was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. There, on March 10, 1997, he was attacked by another inmate and stabbed in both eyes, leaving him permanently blinded in the right eye. The mountain of paperwork assembled by the Ripper team was one of the reasons why the investigation was unsuccessful for so long. It was one of the major factors that led to the British police forces following an inquiry into the failings in the Yorkshire Ripper case in 1982 to set up the first UK centralised crime computer in 1987. It was originally named the Home Office Major Inquiry System, but someone realized that by adding the word large, its acronym would be HOMES, with all of its literary detection connotations, and as such, it is known. Documents released in 2006 under the Freedom of Information Act confirm the inefficiency of the Ripper investigation. In a December 1981 report, an inspector of constabulary wrote, "It is my firm conclusion that between 1969 and 1980, Sutcliffe was probably responsible for many attacks on unaccompanied women, which he has not yet admitted." His inquiry found that a list had been made of 850 suspect vehicles whose owners had been seen picking up prostitutes, and that in March 1979, Sutcliffe was one of only 3 car owners who had previously been recorded as a triple area sighting. In June 1980, he was interviewed for the 11th time after behaving suspiciously and driving erratically, and was held for drink driving. However, he was released after he had been eliminated from the inquiry on handwriting, that is, on the evidence of the hoax letters.